When Japanese media talk about Muslim, I think they have a very specific idea of who those people are, and I think that's unfortunate. One thing that is missing is the ability to provide our own narrative for Muslims who choose to live in Japan. There needs to be a certain level of assimilation. I asked my parents, why did we decide to come back? Why couldn't we just stay in Japan? Oh, like Japan is going to change. I promise 3% of the population isn't going to change Japan.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, subscribing is the best way to support us. It helps us grow and bring you new stories from life in Japan. All right, let's jump in. Welcome to Unpacking Japan, and I'm Toby, and I have the pleasure today to welcome Zhafira. Thank you so much for meeting us here in Osaka.
Thank you for having me.
You're a content creator based in Japan, a country that you've been living in and out of for a while, but now you kind of settled here.
Yeah.
And you do a lot of content for the Muslim community here.
Mm-hmm.
What's it like to be a Muslim here, and what the community is like, and many more things. But that's not all you do. You've done your studies here, you've done academic work, and so we have plenty of things to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm curious, as always, is to go back to the very beginning of your journey and what brought you here to Japan in the first place.
Thank you so much for having me, Toby. I'm really happy to be here. Well, going back to my lore, I like to say that I have a lore because whenever people ask me where I'm from, it's never a straight answer. But what brought me to Japan is I was born in Japan in a little city called Toyota in Aichiken. And the reason why I was born in Japan was because both of my parents were university students in Japan under the Max Scholarship. And so they met here and then they got married in Indonesia and then stayed here for another 10 to 15 years. And that's why my brothers and I, all three of us, are born in Japan.
Oh.
And so I was here maybe until 2005. So I was about 5 years old then, and then left Japan for primary school all the way until high school. And then for uni, I came back to Japan in Osaka University. So Osaka always feels like home.
Yeah. So it's quite a unique experience for you to grow up here and do your early years of school,
Mm-hmm.
and then move back to Indonesia
Mm-hmm.
for some important years for you as well. What are your memories for you that you have of that time of being a child in Japan and then moving away from it?
Interestingly, I remember quite a lot. Whenever people talk about their childhood cartoon that they watch on TV every Sunday or every morning before school, I remember those shows. And I remember just reading the same folk tales and watching the same cartoons. And I remember what it's like to go to a Japanese hoikuen, because my parents were researchers, right? And so they were at the lab morning all the way until evening. And so my brothers and I, we were all in hoikuen from a very young age. I think as soon as maybe we hit 3 months old, 6 months old, we were already in hoikuen. And so, my first language was Japanese because of that, because I was mainly exposed by people who speak Japanese, my teachers, my friends, and it wasn't until I moved back to Indonesia that I finally started learning Indonesian or Bahasa Indonesia the proper way, and then started picking up Bahasa Indonesia as now my mother language, I suppose. So that's pretty much my childhood. Just like any other typical Japanese, you like Anpanman, you like, I guess, Super Sentai, and you like Pokemon, and then you... like any typical kids, watched Ghibli growing up. And I carried that with me even when I was living in Indonesia.
I already have so many questions. I don't know which direction to go first, but I want to stay first on your childhood here in Japan, because we've had a few guests on the show that were born and raised in Japan as Westerners. But you were born and raised in Japan as Indonesian and also a Muslim. So
Yeah.
I don't really know what the customs are like, but you wear the hijab.
Yeah.
That's correct. So from what age do you wear the hijab, and how was it for you to kind of go to hoikuen or primary school as a Muslim here in Japan with your traditional clothing as well?
So for me, I don't think that I have a specific moment when I started wearing the hijab. The main reason for that is because my mom and my parents have always when they're, making sure that I'm fully clothed before school, they help me with my clothes and they help me with my trousers. And then they also help me with my hijab and my jacket as well. And so it's always been part of the like one set of clothing that I would wear before I leave the house. But of course, because I was a child, and as you can tell, summer in Japan can be really, really hot. There would be times when it's just mendokusai to wear a hijab as a child, or I just want to take it off, and that's totally fine. And the school completely understands. I think other than the hijab, or more than the hijab, what was the most significant as a Muslim Indonesian attending Japanese school was, whenever the school introduces customs like Christmas or Halloween or Tanabata, which are things that we don't celebrate as Muslims, my parents would have to have communications with the school side and saying, oh, maybe for these types of holiday, is it possible to, for example, for me to be excluded or for the school to adjust. And more often than not, the school is always so understanding. So that was one example where there would have to be certain communications between my parents and the school side. Another thing that was really big was always food. As you can tell, in Japanese schools, they serve lunch. And in these lunch, there would be things that I cannot eat because I eat halal, right? And maybe some schools, some days they serve pork or they serve non-halal chicken or beef. And certain Muslims eat non-halal chicken and beef as long as it's not pork. But for our family, we try to make sure that all meat that we eat is halal. And so then the school and my mom would adjust in the way that, for these days or certain days where I cannot eat the food provided by the school, my mom would just make like a little bento for me. And she'll try to make sure that the menu is exactly the same so that I wouldn't feel left out or feel othered by my other Japanese friends. And so shout out to my mom. I'm really, really grateful that she was willing to do that, not just for me, but for my brothers as well.
Were there any other Muslim kids at your school that you kind of could relate to? Because, you just mentioned some of the celebrations, Christmas and Halloween, which are, or historically speaking, also not really particularly Japanese either.
Yeah.
But adopted here more commonly than, let's say, Hajj or I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the...
Eid?
Well, there's Eid.
Yeah.
Sorry. And also the Ramadan.
Yes.
Which are not here. So did you have any other students that you could relate with and exchange with and celebrate those moments with in a way? Or was it something that kind of was then just with your family?
I think for school, definitely not. In our school, when we were living in another little city called Toyohashi, it was just my brothers and I think, that were Muslims. There are, of course, other foreigners in the school. I think in Toyohashi, there were primarily Brazilian kids. Either they are Brazilian or they are some of the Nikkei families as well that we were friends with. But when it comes to Ramadan or when it comes to celebrating Eid, usually my mom would gather with the other Indonesian people living in the same city because of work or because of university friends. Sometimes she would have I remember my mom telling me the story of like her Pakistani friend who was also attending uni or was just living there. And so we would gather with the Muslim community in the local mosque, if there is a local one, and then celebrate Ramadan or Eid that way.
You mentioned how the school was quite supportive and willing to adjust a little bit to your culture and your religion. How was it with other students? Because students, especially at a young age, they don't have the knowledge, the understanding.
Yeah.
They just see you're different. And whereas for some of our other guests, the difference was they're white. In your case, you're wearing the hijab on some days, which might draw attention and questions from other students. What were some of the situations the questions you got from others? Were they generally kind of curious in a positive way, or were there some challenges as well for you to kind of explain why you're wearing this and such?
I think when I was in Hoikuen, not so much, because I think when I was in Hoikuen, I was maybe like 4 or 5 and I was not wearing it more often than I was wearing it in school. I think it was very clear from my name and just the way that I look. Even when I'm not wearing hijab, I don't think I look, or I don't think I could pass as Japanese. And I think that was very clear that our family were foreigners. But I think because we all spoke Japanese, it didn't matter. I think with the other kids, my older brother's friends are all Japanese, and my friends are all Japanese. And because we all spoke Japanese, I think at that young age, it probably didn't register to us that we're different beyond the fact that, A is Nihonjin and I'm Indonesia-jin, and then that's it. But of course, when I came back here for university, even though I was in an international program, some of our teachers or professors would be Japanese. And I remember when I was attending PE class, and it was the summer, and I was wearing hijab. And my PE class, my PE teacher at the time was like, "Are you not hot?" Which is often a question that I get. And whenever I get those kinds of questions, I understand that it doesn't come from a place of, I guess, hostility. It doesn't come from a place where they're trying to judge me, but more from a place of curiosity. So when I receive those questions, I would usually just explain whatever questions they have. So in the case of, "Are you not hot?" I would say, "Yes, it is hot," but I'm used to it, right? Because I've been wearing it growing up in Indonesia, where it's a tropical country. It's hot every single day.
Most Muslim countries are hot countries.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
exactly.
There's an adaptation, I think, to it.
Yeah.
Before you went to university here in Osaka, you spent a few years back in Indonesia.
Yeah.
When you moved back there, was there a sort of culture shock for you, having been to Japanese school and having been a minority in the society here, and suddenly being surrounded by people that have all the same customs? Or not all. Indonesia is also very diverse, but a lot of people having similar customs, religion that you can identify with and share these experiences. Ramadan, Eid.
Yeah.
Was there like a culture shock? Suddenly it's different from Japan, or easy adaptation?
I think definitely a huge culture shock. And these culture shock, I think, have very little to do with my religious identity and more to do with just the day-to-day life. So some example that I always say is that I think what's atarimae in Japan, like what's obvious and what's atarimae in Indonesia is very different. For example, when I went to Hoikuen, my brothers and I, we would walk from apartment to school, and that's just normal, right? But in Indonesia, everybody takes the car to go to school. And that was just one thing where I'm like, why are we not walking on the street? Like, why are we always in the car? Another, example that I always bring up is kind of cleanliness or discipline, or how in Japan there is a very, what would you say it? I think there's this culture of just like lining up before you do things. But in Indonesia, I realized that it wasn't atarimae to kind of wait in line and stuff like that. And so I think that was a big culture shock where I was questioning a lot on why we decided to come back to Indonesia. And I remember growing up asking my mom, why did we decide to come back? Because school looked different. The shows on TV looked different. The food is different. A lot of people always find it's so surprising when I can't eat spicy food, because I grew up with Japanese food at home. And so when in Indonesia, they would serve, very spicy, I guess, meat or fish on the table, and I would avoid it. And they're like, why? And I'm like, I can't eat it. It's actually painful for me to eat spicy food. They would be surprised. And so when I asked my parents, why did we decide to come back? And why couldn't we just stay in Japan? One thing that my parents were the most concerned of at the time was how Japan 20 years ago wasn't as Muslim friendly as Japan now, especially because we were living in such a small city. There were very little community, and my parents actually enrolled my older brother and I to karate because they were worried that we were going to get bullied in school. And of course, I don't think that I've experienced that. But there are other friends who are also Indonesians raised in Japan, went to Japanese school, who shared that they were bullied because they were maybe, for example, praying during, I guess, recess. And so I think my parents were mainly worried about us having just like a normal childhood and making sure that we wouldn't have an identity crisis or like a conflict of identity between, oh, I'm Indonesian, but I speak Japanese, but I'm Muslim, but my friends are Japanese. The house practices things that are so different from the school. So who am I? I don't think my parents wanted for us to go through that. And so the decision that they made was to move back to Indonesia, which I understand now growing up, but there were definitely a lot of difficulties for my siblings and I to get used to being in Indonesia, and all of us decided to leave at the end.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that I thought was interesting was reading your blog,
Mm-hmm.
where you share that story of I think you're with your high school team or something in a car and your teacher.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about everything you've done in your life until now. But you were already quite ambitious back then when you were in high school.
Yeah.
And sharing your dreams of doing university and masters and PhDs and going out there and doing things.
Yeah.
With your teachers, and your teacher was kind of saying, well, what's the point of going after all of these things if you're going to end up back in the kitchen?
Yeah.
So going back to Indonesia to kind of, in a way, protect you from things that your parents were worried, kind of also put you in a situation where other cultural norms were not matching what you were after. And then you left.
Yeah.
Was that one of the primary reasons for you to choose to come back to Japan for your university?
I think for sure, there were definitely cases like that where I think my idea of school and the reality of what it turned out to be in Indonesia was just very different because, you know, when you watch like a regular anime or when you watch like a regular drama, like school is very much a place where you pursue, you know, academic activities, and then you do student council, and then you do bukatsu. And these are just very, I guess, very much the norm if you grow up in Japan. And that was what I was imagining for me. Even if I was in Indonesia, these are the things that I was going to do. And I did all of that. But then at the same time, I think the attitude around kind of ambition can be very different depending on which teacher you speak to. And of course, not all of my teachers were like that. But that comment was definitely made by one of my teachers, which made me really sad because I would imagine that, you know, as a teacher, you wouldn't be saying stuff like that to a student. But other than that, I think it was also just how, not to say that this can be generalized because my experience is very different to everybody else's experience. But, you know, little things like not doing homework or cheating during, you know, an exam season and these are things that to me were just mind-boggling because why would you not do your homework, or why would you copy off of somebody else's homework? And maybe that's normal amongst teenagers, but that just didn't feel normal to me, and I was very, very uncomfortable with that. And I realized that learning in Indonesia too was not it wasn't that you would construct knowledge in a classroom together with your teacher and your peers, but it's more like, this is what we're learning today. Look at the whiteboard, write it down in your notebook, and that's it. Maybe, you know, revise it in your own time. And that to me also didn't sit right because it didn't feel like it was helping me grow academically to, you know, be able to kind of critically think about the questions that I think we should be thinking critically about instead of just saying, oh, yes, A equals B. And it wasn't until I decided to, okay, I'm going to study in Japan, I'm going to enroll myself into an international program, that I was finally in a classroom where I feel like it was very much nurturing me in the sense that I could finally learn how to write an academic paper, which I didn't know how to do when I was in high school, which I think is insane because if you go to a school in the UK or America, which where my friends are from, you know, it's totally normal to write a 500-word essay on a topic based on a literature that you read. But we didn't do that in Indonesia, and that was just not the norm if you go to a typical public school or private school. And I think public speaking as well. And I guess I've mentioned critical thinking and the way that you're able to construct an argument, starting with the research questions and then argument A with the evidence A and then B, C, D, and then conclusion. That to me was such a basic thing that should have been taught in high school, but I didn't get that. And so I had to relearn all of that in my first in my first semester, first year of university before I was able to finally catch up with the rest of my friends.
You mentioned that you kind of had an interest already for academia at the time, which I feel like for most high schoolers is not necessarily the case. When I remember my time in high school, most of us were looking for like practical hands-on things like engineering or medicine or law or business management or whatnot. Very few went the academic path. What made you so interested already in high school into wanting to learn to write an academic paper? Did you have like any specific field that you already wanted to kind of do research about?
Not necessarily a specific field, but I think it was because both my parents did their undergrad, master's, and PhD in Japan. So in my mind, school doesn't finish in bachelor's. You know, after you're done with your bachelor's, you have to do your master's. After you're done with your master's, you have to do your PhD. And that was just always the norm for me growing up. It wasn't necessarily that I had like a cause that I wanted to champion. But of course, once I started, you know, understanding more about my passion as well as the general, I guess, courses provided or offered for me, that's when I started exploring a lot of things. So I was in human sciences in Osaka University, and I explored education, human rights, international relations, sociology, anthropology, all of it in my first semester or first year. And then I realized, okay, I am passionate in education, but education itself is very broad. You can talk about childhood education. You can talk about informal education. And I found my passion in sexuality education, which is my current passion project, in my third year when I took this class called Sexuality in Education, where we basically compared the curricula of sexuality education across different countries. So we were comparing Malaysia to maybe the Netherlands to Japan. And I think whether or not your sexuality education curriculum is developed also has an impact to the livelihood of young people living in that country. And it also has the overall impact in maybe the number of STDs and STIs and things like that. And that made me question, okay, for conservative countries like Japan, for example, where we don't have sex ed as developed as European counterparts, why is that? You know, because Japan is not necessarily a religious country, so there isn't necessarily a religious taboo, but taboo does exist, even though Japan is a country where I don't think anyone can argue with me on this, where there is a huge AV industry as well. And so why are we not implementing this education? These are questions that I was starting to think of, and I ended up just doing my undergraduate thesis about it.
Wow, that's quite a unique field of research, and interesting one. I imagine that kind of led you to discover a lot of interesting aspects about how different countries all approach this. What was your experience like at Osaka University, generally speaking, kind of coming back after being away from Japan and now as a young adult, studying, and you've got the academic side of things, but also living independently and by yourself as a student? That was also probably a big new chapter for you.
It was the best decisions that I've ever made, I would say, because a lot of people would, I think when I was talking to my friends in Indonesia and they say, okay, if you want a program that's fully English, those exist in Indonesia. You don't have to go as far as Japan.
Or Singapore.
Or Singapore, exactly. And that was one of the interview questions from my professor when I was applying to Osaka Uni, where he asked, you know, if you want to study in a developed country, there are others to pick from, so why Japan? Japan, to me, was a lot more than just, you know, what the school can offer academically, but it was also very much homecoming. I think because I was raised here, even though it's only the first 5 years of my life, I felt that I feel more comfortable living in Japan. Something that I always say is that even though Japan, like I said, is not necessarily like a religious country, when I think about my identity as a Muslim and my religious practices as a Muslim, I find that I identify these practices in just the day-to-day practices of Japanese people. Like if you lose a wallet in Japan,
you bring it or you go to the koban and you ask.
Exactly, and you ask it and it's right there. And I've done this before. I lost my Zairyu card, I lost my ring. I would go to the nearest lost and found and they will always give it back to you. And to me, that is something that I think any religion would, I think, teach in their practices, right? And in my own as well. But if I were to be in Indonesia where it's 80% Muslim, if I lose a wallet, I lose a wallet and it's not going to come back. And to me, that's just the shocking difference of, okay, there is a country that's Muslim majority and there's one that's where I would be a minority, but there I would feel more in tune with what I actually believe and value and practice. And so coming back to Japan was a lot more homecoming, was more of a homecoming situation. And then other than that, living alone was a big difference because in Indonesia, it's quite common for, I think, maybe middle-class household to have housekeepers. I think in Japanese, I usually say kaseifu-san, where they live in your house.
Oh, okay.
And I grew up having 2 housekeepers living in our house constantly, and they would be the ones cooking for me or helping me with stuff, cleaning. And so I did not do chores growing up, which is not something I'm proud of, but that was quite common. I didn't do chores growing up. I didn't have to help my parents with laundry, cooking, or anything like that. My parents don't do any of those as well. We ask for our household assistants to do that for us. But in Japan, coming here, of course, you have to figure out how to do everything on your own. And I think that was very helpful to kind of just being thrust into the jungle and learn how to survive on your own, because otherwise, when are you going to learn, right? And then, of course, there's the social aspect as well, where very different to when I was 5. Now I'm in a university setting where we have cultures like nomikai, or just, outside of nomikai, my international friends like to party sometimes. And there will be drinking involved, and I don't drink alcohol. And so I have to navigate those conversations with my friends where, I remember one time somebody offered me like a can of beer or something. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't drink. And then he was like, oh, is it because you're misenen? Is it because you're not 20 years old yet? And I'm like, no, it has nothing to do with that. It's just that I'm Muslim and we don't drink alcohol. And just kind of having to explain my religion a lot was something that I had to go through. But I think it was very helpful because I got to relearn my own faith. That way, I think a lot of Muslims grow up inheriting their faith from their parents, right? And I think being in Japan, 17 years old at the time, 17 to 21, having those difficult conversations with my friends helped me relearn my own faith that I thought, was just cultural or atarimae this whole time.
I can also imagine that when you were talking about your hoikuen years, you were the only Muslim in the school together with your brothers.
Yeah.
And so your religion and such was primarily a part of the family.
Yeah.
But now coming to a very large university in Japan, there were probably also other Muslim students. Yeah. Maybe some others from Indonesia, maybe Malaysia, maybe
Egypt, so many.
So how was it for you to then maybe find a student community of Muslims in a sort of diaspora that you could relate to and share that experience with?
So yes, one way that I was looking for this diaspora is through university. So I think a lot of universities in Japan today, especially the top 10 ones, they are quite capable to accommodate to Muslim students. So for mine, we have 3 campuses, and in all 3 campuses, we have halal food in the cafeteria and we have prayer spaces.
Oh.
So in the campus that I go to, or that I went to in the first 2 years, we have a prayer room. And in that prayer room, we do so many things. We do iftar together during Ramadan. That's where I would just go and pray if I'm still on campus during prayer time. That's where we would just spend like Ramadan activities together. And I think the most interesting thing that we did was that we would sell halal meat. So we would have a huge fridge and we would stock it up with like halal beef, halal chicken, halal everything. Wow. Nobody would be, there to sell things. We would have the price kind of taped on the wall.
And then you put the money in a box.
Exactly. And
kind
you
of
put
like
the money in
the
a box.
farmers are selling their vegetables on the countryside, and they just leave it out there and that's really nice.
Exactly. So when I want to do my groceries, I just go to the prayer room and I just, do my math and then put the money in and then just take it home.
So more than a prayer room, more like a multi-purpose room for the community.
Which was very helpful. And then, of course, outside of the Muslim community on campus, there were also the Indonesian community. So Indonesian community in Japan, we all have WhatsApp group chats, Line group chats based on where you live. And with Osaka, we were in the same group chats as people living in Osaka and Nara. And in there, you have, all sorts of like community events announcement or announcement from the consulate on when Eid is going to be, or if there's going to be an open house at the consulate for like an Eid fest or Eid feast. And so that's where I would, find home away from home if I feel like I want to be surrounded by my Muslim brothers and sisters.
You mentioned prayer,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand that there are specific times at which you're supposed to pray.
Yes.
How was that for you to manage this? Because if you're living in a Muslim country, I
Mm-hmm.
imagine everyone knows it, everyone accommodates for it.
Mm-hmm.
Companies, schools probably take a break at that time to allow you to do your prayer. But here in Japan, that's not the case. So when the prayer time was during classes, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe while you had a baito, or how did you manage these here, or were people actually very accommodating to it?
So, yes, very accommodating. I think for me, especially when prayer times are during classes, first I would make sure that my classes are in times that make sense to me the most.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, there are sometimes classes that would be during prayer time. And when that happens, I usually just ask my professor if I could leave the room for maybe like 5 minutes, do my prayer, and then come back. And they're usually very accommodating to that. I think it's helpful that I was in an international program, so all my professors also came from different backgrounds. And so I'm sure it wasn't the first time that they heard that question from a student. When I was in Baito, I made sure to work in a halal restaurant. And in a lot of halal restaurants in Japan, they usually have a prayer room. So I would just do my prayers there. And so even with the way that I was kind of architecting my environment, I was very mindful and purposeful to what my to my religious needs. I think a lot of us in the past especially also used to just, bring your prayer mat everywhere and then find like a random corner, and then you just do your prayers there. Although I think we try to do it less and less due to the increasing islamophobia on social media, where Japanese people would kind of post that on Thread or X or Instagram or anywhere, and say, why would you do this in public spaces? Maybe are you not like a dhamma or like a bother to people walking by, which I totally understand. And so yeah, I usually just go to places where there are prayer rooms, which are, there are more than you can think of in Japan.
You brought up an interesting topic about the perception of Muslims here in Japan, and I think
Yeah.
we'll have quite a few things to talk about on this. So I want to get into that a little bit later.
Okay.
Because before that, you mentioned another thing that is very important as part of your culture is eating halal food.
Yes.
And you had that challenge when you were in school as a kid.
Yeah.
Quite a few years later, you come back. What is the situation like now today? Is it easy for you to find halal food, or do you still have to go back to the campus to get the fridge from the prayer room and get your meat there? Or is there more accessibility with restaurants or halal supermarkets throughout the country?
It has definitely progressed. And I think the main reason for this was because of the Tokyo Olympics that was supposed to take place in 2020 before COVID happened. And in preparation for the Tokyo Olympics, the Japanese government was actually really, I guess they really tried to implement halal or Muslim-friendly accommodations, especially in areas where the games would take place. So in Tokyo, they started installing prayer rooms in stations. So if you go to Tokyo Station, there is a prayer room there. And if you go to Shibuya, I think there's at least 2 department stores with prayer rooms there. And I think they started supporting a lot of restaurants in Japan to serve a halal menu. And in Asakusa, so Taitoku, which is where Asakusa is in, I think from one of my conversations with people who are active in the halal F&B industry in Japan, they said that Taitoku even subsidized halal restaurants so that they would have an easier time setting up and starting and actually providing business to Muslim tourists coming from Southeast Asia, which are Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia mainly. So it has definitely grown. I think even with where I work now, I work in Shibuya. I know that I can go to at least 5 different restaurants all within, just like 5-minute walk or 10-minute walk from where I work. And so I would say Japan has become an easy place to live in if you're Muslim, especially if you live in the bigger cities like Osaka, Kyoto, Tokyo, where you have a lot of tourists.
You said that one of the reasons why your parents wanted to go back to Indonesia was that the way Muslim communities accepted in Japan was different 20 years ago and
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
But you still brought up that now, especially with social media, which wasn't popular 20 years ago,
Yeah.
there are still conversations going on around the topic. So how did you perceive this first when you kind of moved back to university and as an adult kind of looked at the situation? So not as a child, but you are able to sense and understand people's questions, people's reaction better, maybe with more context, and also encounter situations like the one you described with public praying being filmed and posted on social media.
Yeah, this is quite interesting because when I first came back to Japan as a university student, I definitely did not see it as much as I see it now on social media. And I think it has definitely proliferated in the last year. And I'm not sure if that's just in line with Japan's current political scene, where you have a lot more conservative leaders, expressing their opinions, and then it somehow enabled this conversation. But I do want to say that it is in no small part. I think some part of it can be also the community's fault. And the reason why I say that is because, one super viral video that came out was when it was Friday prayer. So it was during Friday. And there were a lot of people on the street just, leaving the mosque, and they were right in the middle of the street. And, there are cars that wanted to pass through, but they couldn't because these people are just like talking on the street. And maybe that's something that you can do when you're in your home country, because during Friday prayer, everyone knows that these types of gatherings are happening. In Japan, of course, it's not as common. And so that became super viral on social media. And then people started talking about their personal experience with Muslims, which may not have been positive, or they just express their own opinions based on what they know. And then, of course, there's another time when there was another viral case on Thread where a Muslim family demanded that a Japanese public school, stop serving pork for lunch. And when I was having discussions with my Japanese Muslim friends about that, we agree that in these types of scenarios, I think there needs to be a level of understanding for Muslims who choose to live in Japan, that it's not going to be perfect, that it's not going to be the same as if you choose to stay in your home country, because you can't come into a country and then demand for the whole country to accommodate to your needs. There needs to be a certain level of assimilation, the same way that other faiths or religion in Japan, I feel, has assimilated to a certain extent. I remember having a conversation with my friend who went to church, and she explained how in a Japanese church, the priest and everybody would speak in Japanese, right? The announcement on the bulletin board, everything would be in Japanese. But if you walk into a mosque today, I think very few mosques speak just Japanese. It'll be the national language of, whatever national group started that mosque. For example, in Meguro, where we have the Indonesian school, it is connected to a mosque that was built by the Indonesian community. And so, of course, people who go there are mainly Indonesians, and the social media and all the announcements are made in Bahasa Indonesia, when in reality, you're in Japan. In my opinion, there should be catering to Japanese speakers as well, because I think the main purpose of a mosque is not necessarily just to cater to the Muslim population and not only serve as home away from home, but also to bring like a certain level of understanding and awareness and education to the local community and integrate and assimilate. And I think out of all the mosques in Japan, I know maybe only 2 that does it really, really well. And these are because these mosques are also, funded well. And so they have the ability to hire maybe Japanese speakers and make content in Japanese. And those has been, I think, one of my biggest, frustrations, where, if you choose to be Muslim in Japan, then the faith itself shouldn't be, like a foreigner, like it's a faith that belongs to the foreigner, because we do have Japanese Muslims as well amongst us, who reverted through maybe intercultural marriage, or they, Japanese studied abroad and then coming back to Japan and they decided that they wanted to revert to Islam. And I have a lot of those friends as well, but all these information and the way that the community is at the moment is still very spread out, mainly speaking English. And I think, there needs to be a certain level of assimilation that I don't think everyone is on the same page at the moment.
How big is that community? I have no idea.
The reverts?
No, the Muslim
just the Muslim in general.
Japan in general.
So the most recent paper I read is that there's at least 300,000 in all of Japan, centered in the greater Tokyo area or Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto. And I think out of those 300,000, maybe around 25% are the reverts, either through marriage or just contact with like Muslim people, either at work or at university.
Way more than I thought it would be. Interesting.
It feels a lot, but when you think about it, it's still less than 3% of the entire Japanese population. And so when there are comments on social media saying, oh, there's so many of them, or, like Japan is going to change, I promise 3% of the population isn't going to change Japan. But I do agree that for Muslims who do choose to come to Japan, it's not going to be like home. And there needs to be that level of understanding, I think.
What are some of the kind of common misconceptions you're facing? Not necessarily islamophobia, but questions you get from people that may not necessarily know so much about Islam or about Indonesian culture, and that they might think, oh, this is why you do this, or...
I think the really easy example is Ramadan, because you fast 30 days, no food, no water, but only from specific time, right? Sunrise to sunset. And when I tell people that I'm fasting during the day, they would say, oh, but how do you do that without drinking water? Or a lot of them think, they forget that there is a certain time period where I can eat, and they assume it's like 30 days of starving myself. And so it's little things like that where I would usually have to explain. Sometimes I get questions about the hijab where they would say, okay, so do you go to sleep with it? And I'm like, no, I don't wear it at home. I only wear it when I'm going out. I think those are probably some of the biggest misconceptions that people have. And I mean, those are very, very easy to explain. I think that's probably it.
And then there are these social media cases, right, that kind of bring up a lot of conversations, but no real anchor, no real thing to discuss, right? Ultimately, the first example you gave is a group of people standing in the middle of the street, which are bothering people. Yeah. And the other example was also something where maybe just like the case of a family making a demand to a school, which you are not necessarily tied to religion so much, rather than like personal behavior.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, now that you brought that up, I think I can think of a few tweets that I've read on X where people are saying, oh yeah, like I know this one Egyptian guy, or I know this one like Pakistani guy, or like I know these like group of Indonesian people living in X areas who are, causing commotions. And of course, these types of foreigners exist. And I think these type of foreigners are, I'm sure, not just those group of people. I think it's everyone coming to Japan. But then, of course, when it's certain group of people, it just becomes a lot more highlighted than others more often than time. And that's unfortunate. I remember, recently there was a no immigrant protest happening. And I remember the posters were shared across group chats. And even though the title was no immigrants protest, the image, which was, I think, made by AI, were, people who look like South Asians and then women who wear hijab. So when they say immigrants, they have a very specific idea of who those group of people are. And when they think of Muslims, they think of those specific group of people rather than, your typical Japanese Muslims born and raised in Japan, or your Hafu friends who are also born and raised in Japan and are Muslims. And so I think these are probably the common misconception of who can be Muslim in Japan, where the community itself is so diverse. There are your, third culture kid like me, right? Who are born and raised here, speak the language, goes to school like everybody else, are probably trilingual. And then there are the Japanese reverts. There are even people who came here. I think there are the Indonesians who came here for study. And then there are the Pakistanis who came here under business visa in the 1980s and then married to Japanese and then have Hafu kids. And then there are also the recent comers who are here just for work, or students who are here under scholarship. So even the layers of Muslim community is so vast. But then when the media or Japanese media talk about Muslim, I think they have a very specific idea of who those people are. And I think that's unfortunate.
And I imagine that this may be one of the reasons you started making content to kind of try to break up some of the stereotypes, try to explain some of the situations, and try to provide information to that very vast and diverse community. Is that right?
Yes. But even then, I think, even with content creation, one thing that I think is missing in Japan at the moment is the ability for the community to kind of provide our own narrative. And I think that's really what's missing because, you have all these hate comments on social media. And out of all the Muslim friends that I know, only one person would actively, I wouldn't say fight back, but at least be a part of that narrative and engage in discussions in Japanese, because these discussions cannot happen in English. These people commenting are all, typing their hate comments in Japanese. But as community, I think we haven't gotten to a point where we could, own like a media space in Japanese and then share our thoughts in Japanese and explain who we are in Japanese. And I think that's where we really need to work together as a community because, the point is not to fight back and the point is not justify, our existence, right? We don't have to do that, but at least be part of that conversation in the local language where that conversation is taking place and offer a different perspective. And I think that's something that we haven't been doing. And that's something that, hopefully one day in Japan, I can kind of spearhead as well, where we can have, a podcast show like this, where it's done fully in Japanese by Muslim people living in Japan who speak Japanese. And that way, I think we can kind of bridge that miscommunication or misunderstanding or misinformation a lot better.
So you're talking about these kind of controlling or having a say, being part of the conversation.
Yeah.
In Japanese especially, not just the online conversation.
Yeah.
Where do you think should that conversation happen? There are so many layers, right? There's the main Japanese media platforms like NHK. There are government discourse. There are local radio stations and these private social media channels like your own, where you have a very large community of people that follows. But where is the best place for that conversation to happen in a way that it has the impact that you're after, which is basically bridging those cultural differences and bringing just an understanding between two different communities that are sharing a common living space?
I think if we could eventually go into TV, then that would be amazing. And I know that this has been done before on a one-off situation. And of course, it's not going to be like a constant coverage of the Muslim population living in Japan. And so I think what would be more sustainable and what, places where we could fully control our narrative would be to create our own private media, I guess, like studio, and where we have ownership of exactly what we want to say and we have control of the narrative. I think social media can be a good place because, everybody can get engaged and it can be shared to a large group of people. You don't necessarily have to own a TV. And you can, maybe add a subtitle in English to help, still be inclusive to the larger Muslim population living in Japan. And so I think social media is a good place to start, since those conversations are also happening in social media.
And you have built a pretty big following for yourself. How has that impacted your life here in Japan to share your story online, share your perspectives, your insights, and have people joining from Indonesia, from Japan, into the comment section and kind of being part of this conversation?
I think that I could definitely do more. Right now, when I do create content for the Muslim population or for the Muslim community, it's mainly about F&B. So, there's a new halal restaurant in Shibuya, come visit. Or there's this prayer space that just opened up in Ginza. But it has my current, I would say, content does not address these types of, I guess, topics as much as I want to, but it is in the goal, in the plan to kind of start that discussion and also engaging other people. One, I guess if there's one thing that I'm quite hesitant on leading that discussion is because I wasn't fully raised here. And so in one discussion that I had with another Indonesian who were raised in Japan, I didn't go to a Japanese shogakko, tsugakko, kokosei. I didn't go to a Japanese elementary school all the way until high school, right? And so the experiences that I have doesn't fully represent those of people who are actually here their whole life. And in that way, I feel like I wasn't the right person to kind of lead the discussion. And so right now in the process of engaging other people who did go through those experiences and provide a platform for them rather than being the person to start that conversation, if that makes sense. And of course, the end game or like the end goal is to engage a lot more people within the community, not just the Indonesian ones living in Japan, but also, like I said, the business owners, the doctors, the professors, everybody.
All of this happens with and around you during your university years.
Mm-hmm.
And then you write your thesis about sex ed in different countries and in Japan. You graduate and then you're off to Harvard.
Yes.
At a time where you kind of came back, and I imagine it took some time to get used to it again, and you become part of the diaspora, you become part of the community, of the conversation. Why did you choose to then leave again in a way and take us some time off Japan?
I think for me at the time, I didn't know if there was a place for me in Japan. And to kind of break that down, I spoke mainly English and Bahasa Indonesia, and I do speak Japanese, but it wasn't to a level where I would be able to do the regular shukatsu process, the regular job hunting process, where you would do an internship in your third year, and then you get your naite in your third year, and then as soon as you graduate, you start working in that company. My level of Japanese wasn't to that level, right? And so I thought, okay, either I try to find a company here in Japan where I could work in English, or I explore my research topic a bit more. And for me, I chose to explore my research topic because at the time I did feel really, really strongly about it. What I wanted to do with my research was to develop a sex ed curriculum that can be faith-based and faith responsive, if that makes sense. And when I say faith, of course, I'm mainly talking about Islam. So Islamic-based sex ed, that was my main research topic. And that was my research proposal when I started applying for grad school. And the reason why I wanted to talk about that topic is because I don't think that sex ed cannot be Islamic. I think the opposite, teaching sexuality education to your children is more Islamic than it is not, because it is the responsibility of a parent to teach these topics. And there is an Arabic term called tarbiyah jinsiyah, which literally means, sexuality education. Mm-hmm. And if you read this parenting book by this author, which has been translated across different languages, it's part of the handbook into, your parenting guide. In Islam, you have to talk about this topic. But of course, there's culture, right? And I think like in Japan, culture can be can provide a barrier towards discussion on sexuality education. And so my goal was to say, it's not the faith that's creating this taboo, it's the culture in which you're raised in. And these discussions can happen. Of course, it's not going to be the same exact curriculum that was developed in the UK, right? Because sex ed needs to be culturally sensitive and culturally responsive, and the cultures of both countries are so different. It's not going to be the same as the curriculum developed in Scandinavian countries, and that's totally fine because there's no one size shoe fits all when it comes to sex ed. So I thought, okay, I can work anytime, but doing this research, I want to do it while, I still had that I guess passion, I would say. And at the time, COVID was happening, and I think everybody was taking their emergency masters, and I was one of those people. And so I started writing my research proposal, sending it to a lot of universities. Harvard was one of them, because I did want to develop like a learning tool. So my school was called Harvard Graduate School of Education. And my program was Learning, Design, Innovation, and Technology. So it's not necessarily for people who want to be an educator or to be a teacher in a classroom, but it was more for people who want to build an edutech, where you want to create a learning kit or a system that can help teacher teach better in a classroom. And my goal was to build that sex ed curriculum.
How different was your academic experience and research on that topic in Japan and in the US?
I think the way that I did my master's was very different to the way that I first started that research in Japan. So in Japan, my research was very much comparing different countries, different Muslim majority countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Turkey, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and then, of course, Japan, because I was in Japan. And then in the US, it was mainly about putting together what I've researched into a curriculum that can be taught. And so I remember in one of the courses that I had, I built a menstrual health education class that is targeted specifically for Muslim girls. And I remember partaking into a competition where it's for students in our department to pitch our social impact idea. And I brought this, social impact idea to that competition, and I pitched it. And I think what's interesting is that one big difference that I definitely faced is, the conception, the understanding of sex ed or menstrual health education as something that's deeply, deeply, deeply cultural. Because, I started my pitch saying that the current existing sex ed curriculum that you can find online are created by the global north, right? And when I talk about the global north, I mean, the people who are in the UN, the people who are in the UNESCO and wrote the Comprehensive Sexuality Education Guide. And those don't take into consideration the things that are happening in the rural villages in Indonesia, where girls think that when they're on their period, they shouldn't be drinking soda. Or when girls are on their period, they shouldn't be washing their hair, or they cannot go out for a swim. And these are very highly cultural because, I don't think girls growing up in the US think that when you're on your period, you shouldn't be drinking soda or you shouldn't be washing your hair. Like, these are things that you can do anytime, in any condition. And so having to explain that and having to explain to my professors who are raised in the States how contextually I come from a very different world, even though I am in Boston at the time, in a classroom with all these people who are also in Harvard, the impact in which I want to make goes back to where I'm from. And that was something that I think I had to explain quite repeatedly.
You explained how your research topic is very much based on the culture that you grew up in and can be quite taboo in some cultures and also in some religions. We talked before about the perception of the Muslim community here in Japan.
Yeah.
But what I'm curious about is, what was the perception of your research topic by the Muslim community? Because it is so sensitive. When you had conversations with other Muslims, and maybe the reaction was different with Muslim women and Muslim men. But how was that perception? Was it something that, why are you studying this? This is taboo, you shouldn't research? Or was there actually support because finally someone is talking about this, and we need that curriculum, we need someone to make some change?
I think a bit of both. So when I first started talking about it a lot more on my personal social media account, I've had a lot of girls DMing me and saying, thank you for explaining this. I didn't realize ABC. And sometimes, I would talk about something as simple as, there's a vulva and then there's a vagina. And these are two different things. And I don't know if girls know what a vulva is, at least where I'm from. And so it's little things like that where I would just share stuff on social media based on what I've researched. But my actual research, I had to do a interview and a questionnaire to 2 Islamic schools in Japan. So there's 3 in total in Tokyo at the time. And I went to these 2 schools that are very different in terms of the demography of the school. One school was mainly, so the first school is in Shibuya. And the students who are enrolled there are mainly kids of expats and ambassadors living in Japan. And then the other schools are mainly people who moved to Japan maybe as like a migrant worker. And so the demography is very different. One school, I think 50% are Japanese Muslims. And the other school, it's, 80-90% of one nationality, at least for the parents. And so the more diversity there is, the more relaxed the school is when it comes to a topic like this, because these discussions will happen amongst the students. One school have students coming from the States where it's probably discussed from an early age. And so among students will talk, and then teachers will come in and clarify or engage them in a more, I guess, constructed educational discussion. One school, when everybody comes from the same background and the same understanding of what's okay and what's not, they know not to talk about it. And so discussions on sex ed don't happen as organically. And, if the teachers don't believe that it should be imparted, then it doesn't get imparted to the students. And so even within the Muslim community in Japan, the behavior can be very different. The most pushback I've gotten is, so right now I have a social impact in Indonesia where we teach sex ed in underdeveloped regions back home. But of course, for schools who want to access our curriculum and have our teachers come to their schools and teach, one session, we also have that kind of product to offer. And usually before our teachers go to the school to have 1-hour session, we would show our deck, our PPT, to confirm if it's okay to show the graphic stuff. And we've had teachers say, can you please take those down? And it is unfortunate, right? Because sometimes learning can be quite visual. And if you don't know how it looks, then you might not know how, so having visuals to us anyway, when we first started building the curriculum, is quite necessary part of the conversation. But they said, can you just say it? Can you just mention it and not show images? And of course, we can always push back. But for us, the main goal is for kids to learn. And if us pushing back means that they're going to completely, change their mind and not use our service, then we can't have that, because we do believe that children needs to learn. And then so sometimes we have to make compromises where we need to. But more often than not lately, a lot of schools and a lot of parents, I think having millennials as parents have been very helpful, because they do understand the importance. And we have parents who have taken our courses when their kids are as young as 5, so that they know that sex ed isn't necessarily just about the reproductive organs, but it starts with bad touch, good touch, naming your body parts with its actual biological name rather than, calling it something else, and having, like assertive communication. These are all parts of sex ed that can be taught from a very young age. And I think now there is a general understanding that it should, like, these conversations should happen.
When you're undergrad, you explore the topic and kind of how it's being discussed, how it's being approached in different cultures. In your grad school, you decide to build a curriculum that kind of addresses, I assume, some of the things you perceived to be issues in your undergrad. But after that, you kind of took a step away a little bit from academia altogether.
Yeah.
So I imagine the PhD might still be somewhere on the corner at a later date.
It's right there.
It's right there. But you've taken a step away from it and you came back to Japan.
Yeah.
Not to Osaka, but to Tokyo this time around. What spurred the move back and what are you working on right now?
The reason why I wanted to move back and take a step back from academia is because I realized that if I do want to scale the social impact that I'm running at the moment, that I need to have a business management knowledge. And I thought, or experience, and I thought the easiest way to gain business management experience is by working in a company or maybe going to a business school. But even with business schools, they don't let you in until you have maybe like 5 years of experience, right? Because then how would you know what you're talking about? And that was very much how I felt as I was running this social impact. I wanted for it to be more serious, but the way that I was running it at the time feels very much like a school project. And I realized, okay, this is where I need to learn more outside of the classroom. I can always go back to the classroom, right? It's not going to PhD is not something that it doesn't expire. And so I told myself I should start working either in a school or in a company that works in an education industry. And at the time when I was in Boston, like a management trainee role came up, and I thought that's interesting because I think if you are a management trainee, you definitely get the 360 of an industry quite quickly or a business quite quickly, where you're not just looking at the sales side, but you're also looking at the marketing side and you're looking at the business production side, and so on. And so on. And so I applied and I got in. And so I started doing my MT in Hong Kong for 1 year. And then after I worked in Hong Kong for 1 year, my company offered for me to transfer to Tokyo, since we also have business here in Japan. And because I spoke Japanese, it made sense. And I decided to accept the offer, move back to Japan. And I definitely feel like it was meant to be because I felt like I left Japan searching for maybe my American dream or like a bigger goal. When in reality, I think the reason why, I was born here and raised here and speak all these languages and have these education background is so that I could serve my community. And my community, at the end of the day, are these people who I believe, I owe them so much. And I can go back to Indonesia because that's also part of my community. But for the things that I can do, in Indonesia, anybody else can do that. But for me to be speaking in these languages that I speak, having the platform that I have in Japan, I feel that I have some sort of responsibility to use that to support my people and give back as much as I can. And so, while I'm getting my MBA from this company and kind of just learning business, I'm also slowly reintegrating myself and relearning who the stakeholders are, who runs the F&B, halal F&B industry in Japan, who runs the mosques in Japan, and kind of just getting to know as many people and networking on a weekly basis to understand, okay, if I want to serve my community, who is my community?
Is the community different, the one you found in Tokyo as opposed to the one in Osaka? Or is it, generally speaking, a more like nationwide community where, of course, you've got localized diasporas, but everyone is kind of connected between those large urban centers, at least?
I would say very different because in Osaka, I wasn't as exposed to the global Muslim community outside of the university. So outside of the university, if I were to go to like a Ramadan event or an Eid event, then it would just be Indonesian people. But here in Tokyo, I would go to this mosque in Yoyogi Uehara, which is one of the largest mosques, or maybe even the largest mosques in Japan. And when I go, it's not just Indonesian Muslims, but it's Egyptian Muslims, Dutch Muslims, German Muslims, Japanese Muslims, Muslims of all kind. And that's definitely very different because the needs of these people are also very different. I remember one time just having dinner with Japanese Muslims, and they talk about how they feel disconnected from their Japanese identity after becoming Muslim because they had to stop eating Japanese food. And I was like, why do you have to stop eating Japanese food? And they said, well, because of shoyu and mirin, which have alcohol in them.
Oh.
And of course, this can be very different person to person, but I think the common understanding in Japan is that, for example, mirin, if food is cooked with it, then we don't consume that because mirin is alcohol, right? And I told them, but don't you know that there are a lot of halal groceries in Japan where they can send you a mirin substitute, and I assume it tastes similar, and halal shoyu as well, halal yakiniku tare, everything. But they don't know because this knowledge has been very much kind of gate kept, maybe not purposefully, but gate kept by kind of the Muslim community who are just Indonesians or just Pakistanis. And it doesn't spread out to the Japanese Muslims who are growing in numbers, but then they're like, oh no, now I can't be Japanese anymore. And that's not true. And so that's when I also realized it's so important that we have conversations about Islam in Japanese, because then we're alienating people who are also feeling alienated from their own family, because a lot of my Japanese friends are not out yet, if that makes sense. So their parents don't know that they've converted.
Wow.
And they have to kind of sneak behind their parents' back. And of course, you know, when they do eventually tell their parents, it's not the easiest conversation. And so, you know, who else, if not us, who can kind of support each other, right? And so in that way, I think we need to have the linguistic ability to cater to everybody.
And so this is probably going to be one of your next biggest projects, to kind of set up this media platform in Japanese for people to discuss Islam.
That's the plan.
Like to be a Muslim in Japan, provide tips and information, and also invite, I guess, Japanese people to join the conversation and to understand kind of the different perspective.
Yeah.
And have a dialogue around things. Zhafira, we talked about so many different topics so far.
Yes.
And I want to ask you if there's anything that was important to you that we didn't really get into, that maybe you would have liked to bring up. Because we talked about the academic career a little bit. Now you work in education training, so you're getting your hands-on experience. You talked about your many projects, but is there anything that maybe I didn't ask you that you think maybe we should discuss?
I think, I don't know if there's like any natural way to talk about this, but I think I talk about some common challenges as Muslim, which is to find like halal food and such. But another challenge that the more recently I started hearing is finding employment in Japan as Muslims.
Oh.
And I have two very specific cases. So for men in Islam, we have Friday prayers, and that can take maybe around 1 to 2 hours. And you have to leave the office, go to the mosque, pray, and then come back to the office. And that can be longer than a typical lunch break, which is usually an hour, right? And I've had conversations with my Muslim brother, or when I say Muslim brother, it's not my actual brother. It's a Muslim friend of mine who was laid off because of that. And I've also had discussions with my actual Onichan, older brother, who when he, would take time from class, because he also went to university in Japan like I did, he would, come back a little bit later because he would, spend time doing Friday prayer. And then the professor would say, well, if you would like to go, then maybe you just shouldn't be in this class at all to begin with. And so these types of, I guess, flexibility definitely exist in certain companies, especially for mine, I'm very grateful that when I moved into this company and I said, okay, I would like a room to pray if possible, they easily replaced one of the meeting rooms, not a meeting room, like a phone booth, into a prayer space. And I was very grateful for that. And I know that there are other larger companies who also have prayer spaces in Japan as well. But then there are also other cases where my friends who are women, who are hijabis, and they go to a job interview and they are fully qualified, maybe have a master's degree, and the company says, okay, but on the condition that you take off your hijab. And, in the case of Europe, UK, US, you cannot discriminate, hiring people based on their religious background, right? Officially. Of course, certain cases still happen. But I think in Japan, it's discussed a lot less, I would say. Of course, in a lot of international company, they don't care as long as you perform. But then there are other companies as well where a lot of my Muslim sisters are frustrated because of that. And so I think that is probably going to be an ongoing challenge. And I think that's also why having community matters, because then from casual conversation with your Muslim community, you get to learn, A, work in this company and A, wears hijab, which means this company is open to diversity and so on. And so I think if I could leave a message to all of my brothers and sisters living in Japan, is to kind of reach out to whatever closest community that you have. I think one topic that we didn't get to discuss as well is how even the Muslims in Japan don't like the Muslim people living in Japan.
Oh, okay.
And I wouldn't...
So intra-community conflicts.
Exactly. And this is very real because I would have conversations with my older brother, for example, who is a lot more assimilated to Japan. And he's like, I don't understand why the Muslims would do this. Like, it's giving that name to all of us foreigners living in Japan, not just Muslims. And I totally understand where he comes from. And I think a lot of, for example, Hafu kids who are Japanese and maybe Pakistani or Japanese Indonesian, I think are also raised holding a little bit of, internal Islamophobia, maybe towards their family. One very easy example I can share is this Muslim lady who I went to Hajj with, and she talked about how her daughter asked her to take off her hijab when visiting her school, to pick her up or to attend like parent-teacher meeting or association. So I think Muslim kids raised in Japan also have hard time kind of going back and forth between the two conflicting identities, because I don't think there has been good enough examples of people showing that the two identities can coexist. And so, these are just ongoing challenges that exist. And I unfortunately cannot speak to it because I don't experience that. I think I'm quite lucky in the sense that I'm very much a foreigner at the end of the day. So people don't expect me to behave like a Japanese. So these things definitely exist.
I don't know too much about Muslim practices and what the Quran says. I never read it myself, so this may be a quite naive question. But I'm wondering, for Muslims living overseas, trying to accommodate two different cultures, is there any room for flexibility? For example, you mentioned the challenges of keeping or finding employment because the prayer time on Friday is long and the company doesn't allow the break time for that. Is it possible to have the prayer, for example, later in the evening, or would that be considered a sin? Or you mentioned there's alcohol in mirin and shoyu. There's alcohol in there, but perhaps maybe a different kind of alcohol than the image we have of sake or
vodka.
So in these kind of situations, how much flexibility does the Quran provide, or is it up to people's individual desire to upkeep certain religious practice to a certain level? Because I think I've met some Muslims that don't necessarily do all the prayers, and that are more relaxed with certain things. So how is that being discussed, or how is that being potentially implemented as part of this kind of these challenges?
I think I would like to first give a disclaimer that I'm not a religious leader. So my opinions or knowledge in this case will be quite limited. But first, I remember having similar conversations with a friend of mine who does study the Quran quite extensively, studies in Egypt. And he says everything that's not in the Quran means there's room for discussion. I wouldn't say room for flexibility, but room for discussion. And that room for discussion really depends on which school of thoughts you follow, because in Islam, there's main 4 school of thoughts based on 4, I guess, religious leaders in the past. And in Southeast Asia, we follow 1 school of thought, Southeast Asia, East Asia. And with that said, I remember having conversations with maybe American Muslims who says, oh, if it's shoyu and it's fermented, then it's not, like you said, it's not like it's like liquor, right? And so if it's the kind of alcohol that's naturally created through a fermentation process and it's not harmful and it's less than X amount of %, then it's still considered permissible. So that's one example about food. About prayers, I think in this scenario, I would imagine that it's not something you can replace. But even with Friday prayers, there is like a certain level of tolerance in the sense that if you ideally you go, but as long as you don't, constantly skip it like 3 times in a row, then I think you can make it up by praying your regular prayers during that afternoon time. So I think certain people kind of abide by that, where if they really can't, then they don't go, and they just replace it with the normal prayer in the afternoon. But then there are also people who feel so strongly about it that they would rather quit their job rather than be in a company that doesn't allow them to pray. So like you said, even amongst the Muslim community, I think the spectrum of religiosity or to which level you would practice, or in the community, we like to say the halal haram ratio, the ratio in which you practice and the ratio in which you don't practice can be different. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really what you're comfortable with, right? And it's really what you believe as a person.
And one more reason to have extensive conversations on the topic in English, in Japanese, in any language, because it is complex, it is personal, it is cultural, it's religious, and there's no answer that will satisfy everyone, but maybe through conversations we can get a better understanding of others. Zhafira, thank you so much for sharing your many experiences, your many thoughts on these. We'll make sure to link all your accounts in the description so people can go and find all the nice information you provide there if they want to try
Thank you so
halal
much.
restaurant, whether or not they eat halal food.
Yes.
The food is still delicious. And much more. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Toby.
Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.
Wow, super interesting. Thank you for sticking with us all the way till the end. We really appreciate it. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the podcast. It helps us improve the show and bring you more in-depth conversations from Japan. Take care and see you next time.